Okay, now let's step back and look at the larger context of this here. What's going on and why do the French have this interest in the English? What's going on here? Let's get the larger sense about this. And all this is a part of the beginning of the Renaissance, this larger intellectual movement that would sweep through all of Europe, really beginning in Italy and sweeping through all of Europe, beginning mostly in literature and the arts, and then over time coming to music. So we'll talk about first the Renaissance, and then we'll talk about music and how the music. So all of this discussion is, of course, drawn from, it's all outlined as well in the introduction to the second part of your textbook. So the part two, Age of the Renaissance. And please read that to give the larger context for this whole chapter that we're this whole module that we're doing. And then of course also um, and of course also the chapter reading for this week. Okay. So let's just start with the Renaissance here, a period that we roughly show from 1400 to 1600. And it's rooted in the French word Renaissance, right? Which means rebirth. But think about rebirth of what? A rebirth is a reconnection, right? Getting back in touch with something from the past. And what was it that people of Europe, people of Italy and people of France were getting in touch with? You know, what was the idea? Well, of course, the idea was this rebirth of interest in classical Greece and Rome. And to understand that, let's step back and talk about, you know, what's happening at the end of the medieval period, the 14th century, the period of, Guillaume de Machaut and Philip de Vitry and others as well. The European world of this time was still divided roughly along what you see in this map here, where you have the Western side of Christianity and the Eastern side of Christianity. All of these the map here roughly highlighting where the Roman Empire was when it collapsed, right? So the world was by and large, still ruled by this world of Europe, and the Middle East was still ruled by the Christian church of different sides. Well, with the home of the Western church being in Rome and the home of the Eastern church being held in Constantinople. So things were changing when we get to the end of the 14th century into the beginning of the 15th century. The Turks, Muslim leaders, Muslim armies were making inroads, and particularly the Ottoman Turks were pushing their way west. And their goal was to capture Constantinople, which was the head of the capital of the Byzantine Empire, but also, of course, the center of the Eastern Christian Church. And they did. They were successful in 1453 in conquering Constantinople. The result of that was the Muslim advance throughout regions that previously were Christian. You can see this here in the parts of Northern Africa that were a part of the Christian church, that were Christianized beginning in the late Roman period, and became part of the Ottoman Empire, became basically is Muslim in culture, culturally Muslim, Islamic, and that's a thing that continues to today. We also see, of course, in the Middle East and what is modern day Turkey, but we also see the Islamification, the kind of extent of Ottoman rule and decades and centuries later into the area of ancient Greece and into Eastern Europe as well. Now, what was one of the major impacts of that is that the church that was in Constantinople, then rechanged to the name Istanbul, the church leaders and church monks and those people who held on to the ancient writings from ancient Greece and ancient Rome in Constantinople, they left. And many of them migrated west many of them to Italy in particular, bringing with them these ancient documents that were transcribed over the decades and centuries by monks in Constantinople, taking with them these ancient Greek writings and such philosophies and ideas. And basically, many of the writings that we know today come from this period where they were forced out of what is modern day Istanbul into Western Europe. And why is that important? Well, it brought these ideas from ancient Greece and ancient Rome to Western Europe. They were brought there, transcribed, and disseminated throughout Europe, and that thereby giving people new awareness, new understanding, new access to ancient Greek ideas. Of course, people of the medieval period were also had some access to ancient Greek writings. Think of the writer Boethius, who developed his philosophy about music, his three-part philosophy of music, which is rooted, we know, in ancient Greek writings that he had access to. But probably only he had access to, a very small number of people had access to that. What made the 15th century access to this literature so important is that it was widespread. It was translated not, from the ancient Greek into the Latin languages and made available to people. So these ideas and philosophies of the classical period were now surging through Europe, and people were, for the first time, really becoming aware of these philosophies. And what did they do? Well, for one thing, they welcomed they so one of the effects of that was that people began to ask questions again. The ancient Greeks were all about asking questions. The ancient Greeks, why is the sky blue? Why does water move the way it does? Why do birds fly? These kinds of questions they were asking and debating among themselves and coming up with philosophies on these things based upon their reason and philosophy and ideas and logic and things like that. And so when people of medieval Europe began to read this, they're like, hey, wait a minute, we have those questions too. This is the period where, of course, the church had all the answers. Why is the sky blue? Why does a bird fly? Why does water move the way it does? Well, the church would say it's because it is God's will, and don't ask questions. But when people of this period began to read how the ancient Greeks were asking questions, they themselves began to ask questions. Who is the church? What is the Bible to tell us about why the sky is blue, why grass grows the way it does, these kinds of things. These are things that the ancient Greeks found out on their own. We also can investigate. So it gave people the encouragement to ask their own questions. And with that, to understand the brilliance of the human mind, of logic, of rationality. So it opened up this new idea, this new appreciation for the human possibility, the human intellect, the human reason. And we see this kind of in the beginnings, we see this in the arts. And I think you can see this distinction between the two, between medieval art and Renaissance art, right? What do you see as differences here in its portrayal of religious subjects? For one thing, I think you can see here just the depiction of people is very, very different. In the medieval picture, we see what's probably like a king, right, at mass in a church. And how do we know he's the king? Well, he's the biggest figure here. It may not be realistic. I mean, he could have been a short king, right? But he's reflected here to symbolically show his greater importance over everybody else. Right. So there's no real sense of realism here. This is about symbolically conveying an idea. Compare that to here, where, we have Jesus who's being pulled down from the cross. He's not separated from everybody else. He's, in a sense, equal like everybody else, kind of conveying the idea that Jesus was a human being just like everybody else was. Look at the way in which emotions are depicted in this picture. We see real crying, suffering, real deep emotions being expressed on the faces. Whereas here, do we see emotions? We kind of see a grumpy old man with grumpy officials and whatever. It just seems like there's not much in terms of emotion, human emotion. Here in this picture, we see a lot of skin. We see a lot of skin, people with clothes on, people without clothes on. Here, of course, everybody has clothes. Here, there's more of the realistic depiction of the human body. You can see that in the movement, in the shape, and the use of lighting to emphasize front and back and movement. Whereas here, in this picture, not very much in terms of this, right? So I would say, in the Renaissance art, we're seeing much more appreciation of the human body, the human form, human expression, human emotions. We see this also in the rise of portraiture as well in the Renaissance period, depicting individuals and trying to capture an individual character. Here we see the beauty of this woman in her beautiful dress. We can even get a sense as to, what her character is. We also see this in this idea of depicting with realism is also evident in the works of Leonardo da Vinci, who did self-portraits first when he was young and throughout his life, even into old age, like returning again and again to the human form and how the form changes over time, showing appreciation for the human form and how it changes. And so Leonardo da Vinci is also drawing back from Roman and Greek sculpture, right? That depicts the human form, giving it great detail, but depicting, so borrowing, like in this particular image, borrowing from ancient Roman or ancient Greek sculpture, but kind of making it modern of his time in the Renaissance. And Da Vinci was just this kind of person. He was asking questions. How is this? How is the body made up? What are its parts? And he would go into these places where there's cadavers and would join with doctors who are taking you know, uh, these dead people apart and understanding how the people are structured, the bone structure, the muscle structure, the sinews, the skin, how the skin moves when the arm moves. And notice the image here on top here. We see the movement of the arm here, from this arm to this arm. There's differences in how the muscles are reflected in the art itself. And what did he do, Leonardo da Vinci? He brought the same kind of awareness of human form, human structure into his own art to depict the human body in as realistic a form as possible, but also in a way that shows how beautiful the human form is. We see in the Renaissance nudes, human nudes, that we just did not see in the medieval period. It was forbidden by the church to present the body in a nude form. So greater realism and appreciation of the human body, human form. We see this also in terms of other kinds of painting here. So what strikes you about this here? This is a painting of a cityscape. Something is going on among the city leaders, but notice these lines in the background telling you this idea, this new way of seeing perspective, what's up at front as opposed to what's in the distance. And you can tell the people in the front are larger than the people in the background. This new understanding of perspective adding to the sense of realism and naturalism in art. And then, of course, Leonardo da Vinci just asking questions. Can humans fly? Well, he's got an answer for that. So Renaissance ideals, this new interest in ancient Greek is giving artists in particular and architects many new ideas, a greater interest in the human body and the form and the potential in the intellect of the humans, desire for greater realism, naturalism, beauty, clarity, and an interest in science and asking questions, right? And also all this gave rise to what we know as this intellectual movement called the rise of humanism, an intellectual movement that studied the things pertaining to human knowledge, right? That had where they had faith in human dignity and the nobility of humans, in human reason and human potential. So then we can bring this idea of humanism and this greater interest in the human form, human body, human potential, in realism and beauty to the music of Dunstable, right? Let's go back to him, and we see that in terms of his upbringing, he's a composer, mathematician, and astronomer. Now, if we know any astronomers today, it'd be pretty rare to find those who are astronomers, but also musicians or theorists, right? Those things just are kind of they don't go together today, but back then, of course, they did. This is an old medieval idea of music being one of the mathematical arts. And so I asked the question here of, how do we know about Dunstable? I mean, we have some very little evidence about him and his life, how he worked in England for an English duke. But the people that were really interested in Dunstable were not the English, they were the French in particular. And we see this in writings of the day here. Martin de Lanfranc, and this is from your textbook reading for today. He wrote a poem where he talked about this here. So this is Martin de Lanfranc, a poet, cleric, and secretary to the court of Savoy, which is in the Burgundian territory, which we'll talk about next, and where Guillaume de Dufay periodically worked as Kapellmeister. Kapellmeister, it's one of these terms I want you to know here. This is the master of the chapel, the one who's in charge of all the music for the chapel, and the chapel being a little church inside a palace or some kind of large estate of wealthy, powerful political people, right? So they would hire these great musicians and composers to come in and run the music for their chapel. And so that's what Guillaume de Dufay periodically worked in the Burgundian area. At the wedding of the Duke's son in 1434, both Dufay and Lanfranc had the occasion to meet Binchois, whose music we looked at before. And he was in the retinue of the visiting Duke of Burgundy. He wrote a poem dedicated to the Burgundian Duke. And in it, Lanfranc praised the music of Dufay and Binchois, both of them we'll talk more about here, in terms that have shaped our view of 15th century music. And so the poem itself, Tapissière, Carmen, Césarée, not long ago sang so well they astounded all of Paris and all who came to hear them. Okay, so in reference to some great musicians of Paris that wowed people, probably during what we know of as the medieval period. But the day came when these musicians, did not descant or sing such finely wrought melody, so those who heard them told me, as Guillaume Dufay and Binchois. For they, Dufay and Binchois, have a new practice of making lively consonants, both in loud and soft music, in feigning, in rest and mutations. They, Binchois and Dufay, took on the guise of the English and followed Dunstable, and thereby a marvelous pleasingness makes their music joyous and remarkable. So things to keep in mind here. This is really gold for historians. There's these people that were great singers of the past, but there came a day where we just said, to heck with them, we're not going to listen to them anymore because we got new people on the block here. Dufay and Binchois that are bringing new music, a new practice, making a lively consonants, right? The triads and the use, the outlining of triads, both horizontally and vertically, this pervasive consonance in the music that took the guise of the English. So, and followed Dunstable. So of course, they're bringing this consonance, and where does this idea of using consonants come from? From the English, following Dunstable. Okay, so there we know exactly what's going on. I want to point out one thing here. For they have a new practice in making lively consonants in both loud and soft music. This is an important point of medieval and Renaissance music. By loud and soft music, we're talking about music meant for outdoors and music that's meant for indoors into a small chamber. That's soft music. And the words they use for they are equally confusing here. Ha and bas. Ha, H-A-U-T, translates as high, and bas, B-A-S, translates as low, right? So it's not high or low, it is basically loud or soft music, referring to music outside or music on the inside. So so basically what he's saying here is this consonants brought to music for both outside music and inside music, these beautiful new consonants that took the guise of the English. And look at the term that in the French itself, right here, consonance anglais. And that's the term that we're going to use and come back to when we talk about this here. Confidence on borrowing from Dunstable, borrowing from the English. And we see that in his motet, Quam Pocere Es, which we spent time on. And the fascinating thing here is that I was mentioning before is that, you know, Dunstable's compositions come down to us not from England, some library or archive in England, but from the library and archives in France and other parts of Europe on the continent, right? So it shows us that Dunstable's music was making its way from England or the English compounds to the French. They were hearing it somehow, right? There was this connection. Somehow they were getting the music from the English and that they liked it and they were distributing amongst each other on the continent. So why all this is important, let's go to the map here and talk about Europe. Looking at Europe, it's a very different animal than what we're used to, right? For one thing, you know, how is this different here? Looking at this, for one thing, where's Spain? Is there a Spain here? There's not. Spain is a collection of three different the sort of territories. Spain itself doesn't exist. How about Italy? Italy doesn't exist. It is a series of city-states, states owned and run by the Pope in Rome, and also lands. It's all, you know, part of the lands of the Habsburg Empire. So Italy doesn't exist. Where's Germany? Germany doesn't exist yet. Where are what we know of as Belgium, Luxembourg, you know, the Netherlands? They don't exist. They're part of what's called the Burgundian lands. And this is the important point I want to lay out here. This is the period, the end of the 14th century, the early 15th century, when England and France were at war. This is part of the Hundred Years' War that you guys read about. And so this is really weakening France, weakening both countries like this. And it was a series of dukes who are all related to the French king out here in the Burgundian lands, these dukes who said, to heck with you, French king, we're going to defect. We don't want to be part of your stupid war. And so they defected. They claimed neutrality. They got it together. They allied together, formed what is, in essence, a Burgundian alliance that claimed neutrality. And what that meant is that they were not for France. They were not for England, and they claimed neutrality, but they are able to trade with both England and France. And they did. They trade arms, you know, they traded food, all these things. And as a result, they became very, very, very wealthy. And this is an important point here. These Burgundian lands almost looks like you know, you can see it's occupying much of France into the lands of Burgundy and that kind of thing. And you can see it's an alliance of different dukedoms that were associated with the French, all coming together, but each one separate, but all kind of working together to hold this alliance together. So these dukes controlled a big part of land, which is now, we know now to be part of Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and central France as well. And because these dukes, as an alliance, each one became so wealthy, they were so wealthy, they were able to draw in great artists from around Europe to work in their palaces. Right. And so they drew in some of the greatest composers and musicians and dancers and painters from around Europe to come and work there. As a result, this Burgundian homeland became kind of a center of musical innovation, musical ideas. So, so let's do a quick test here. What was the region called here? It's called Burgundia. Another one here. Burgundia was ruled by who? The French king, ruled by French dukes, ruled by the Holy Roman Empire, or no one. It was complete anarchy. And of course, it is French dukes who were originally French dukes, but then they claimed neutrality and they kind of broke away from the French king as such. Burgundy declared neutrality in a war against whom? The Hundred Years' War was between what two nations? Spain and England, France and Spain, Spain and Holy Roman Empire, or France and England? Of course, it was France and England. Okay. And Burgundy became a center of arts and music from this period, the period of the war, well, because it declared neutrality and became very rich, very powerful, and was able to draw in artists from around Europe to work there. Now, two of the most famous of these early Burgundian composers working for different dukes at that time were Binchois and Dufay, and I want to talk about these two. This is like the earliest generation of composers that we discuss as the Renaissance period. Beginning with Dufay, with Binchois here. He worked for his duke, the Duke Philip the Good, for about 30 years, became a central musical figure, wrote lots of music, but he's most famous for his chansons, his secular songs, right? And so I want you to take time to look at Binchois' De Plus in Plus, and just kind of think through it here. What is the genre of this piece here? The number of voices, the placement of the dominant melody, the character of the dominant melody, the rhythmic complexities, the use of consonance or dissonance, and the length of the piece. Right? We're not going to take time to do that, but you can go through and look at that here. The one question here, question number 6, we've already figured this out here. Is there consonance and dissonance? Is there dissonance? Is there consonance? There's pervasive consonance, right? And as we hear, as you listen to the music, it is really a blending of different kinds of musical ideas. So remember that these ducal centers drew in people, composers, musicians from all over Europe, and as such, they all brought different ideas. So those musicians being brought up, kind of coming up to work there from Europe, from Italy, brought their sense of Italian music, this effortless, graceful melodies, very conjunct melodies known as sweet melodies, right? From the French tradition, think back to Guillaume de Machaut and the composers of the Ars Nova and Ars Subtilière. They were very interested in rhythm, syncopation, hemiolas, and in complex structures like the rondo, the ballata, and the virelai, complex structures that use the text in really complex ways. And then from the English, we're not quite sure how they got the English into there, but the pervasive consonances, the use of short phrases. So all of these things are evident in Binchois' music, and also Dufay's music as well, because they're all drawn from different parts of Europe. This is why we say their music is cosmopolitan. It is not particularly French. It's kind of a combination of music from all over Europe, mixing together into this new cosmopolitan style. Guillaume Dufay had a different history. He worked for a different duke, but then as a young person, he kind of cut his teeth. He became famous working for a young duke in the Burgundian region. But then there was this he decided he could make more money, not by staying in Burgundy, but by going to Italy and working for rich families in Italy. Just as Burgundia was drawing people from Italy and other parts of Europe up to Burgundia in the north, so were very rich people in Italy, those associated with the church, those associated with elements of trade and such, were becoming fabulously rich, like the Medici family in Florence, and drawing composers and artists and other people to Italy. And Dufay was one of these people, where Binchois spent 30 years working for a single duke, right? Dufay was bouncing around. He was like one of the first popular freelance musicians, kind of going to whoever paid most money. So he worked for the Pope, he worked for the Medici family,